Welcome, everybody. My name is Paul Adamson. I'm going to be moderating this plenary session of UACES 2021 virtual conference. We have a very, very distinguished panel ahead of us. We have 90 minutes to discuss the future of Europe, which I'm sure is more than enough to settle all the problems that Europe and the European Union is facing. Guests will be asked to speak for 2 or 3 minutes at the beginning by way of introduction. I may ask for certain points of clarification afterwards, and then we'll have a panel-wide discussion shortly afterwards. And we'll leave a good 30 minutes at the end to take questions and input from you in the audience for this discussion. Let me briefly introduce the panel. Dr. Rosa Balfa is Director of Carnegie Europe. Her fields of expertise include European politics, institutions, and foreign security policy. Her current research focuses on the relationship between domestic politics and Europe's global role. She has researched and published widely for academia, think tanks, and international press on issues relating to European politics and international relations, especially on the Mediterranean region, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans, EU enlargement, international support for civil society and human rights and democracy. There's much more in Rosa's distinguished bio, but I think I'd better stop there in the interest of time. Helen Drake is Professor of French and European Studies and Director of the Institute for Diplomacy and International Governance at Loughborough University, London. She has published widely on French politics, and her latest co-edited volume, Developments in French Politics 6, appeared with Macmillan in 2021. In 2017, she wrote an early study of France, Britain, and Brexit as part of a wide-ranging research project on the multi-stakeholder Brexit negotiations. Again, her bio goes on for several pages, but I will stop there. Vincent Emanuel Herr is a German author, public speaker, and activist. His areas of interest include European integration and gender equality. As an activist, he successfully lobbied the European Parliament and the European Commission to issue free interrail tickets to European youth as a measure of strengthening European identity. The idea was adopted first as a pilot scheme entitled Discover EU by the European Commission in 2018, and in 2020 was confirmed to become part of the Erasmus Plus program. Again, Vincent's CV goes on for several pages, but I will stop there for him. Shada Islam runs her own global strategy company called New Horizons Project, having been director for Europe and geopolitics at Friends of Europe, and before that a journalist with the Far Eastern Economic Review, also a senior advisor at the European Policy Centre and visiting professor at the College of Europe Natolin, and a columnist for The Guardian, Politico, and EU Observer. Last but not least, as they always say, Brigid Laffan is Emeritus Professor at the European University Institute. Brigid was Director and Professor at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies and Director of the Global Governance Programme and the European Governance and Politics Programme at the European University Institute, Florence, until her retirement last month. Previously, Brigid was Professor of European Politics at the School of Politics and International Relations, University College Dublin, and Vice President of UCD and Principal of the College of Human Sciences from 2004 to 2011. Again, the CV goes on, but hope you all forgive me, speakers, if I just cut you all slightly short there. So the theme of the discussion, as I said earlier, is the future of Europe. Panelists can define that as the European Union as it currently stands, the European Union as it may be contoured in the years to come, or the broader continent of Europe. So I'm going to turn first to Rosa and ask you, Rosa, what are your main interests and concerns about how the future of Europe is developing? What are the points of concern that you have about how the Europe is developing as we speak?
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for inviting me. I have an enormous amount of concerns about the future of Europe. Of course, the climate emergency is probably the greatest challenge of our time. We are still in the midst of a pandemic which has revealed divisions within our societies and globally. But I think in order just to narrow perhaps the discussion, maybe just take as a cue the current affairs and what's happening now, and how Europe is responding or not to this Afghanistan debacle. Because I think through that, perhaps we can identify a set of perhaps more specific issues, concerns, and perhaps analyze a little bit how politics is responding to this today, and then perhaps from, taking the starting point from current affairs, then perhaps open up the broader package of issues and the more existential package of issues that Europe is facing. So with Afghanistan, it's quite interesting to look at the debates in the various capital cities. In places like London, government and opposition is up in arms because it's showing it's revealing the realities of post-Brexit Britain, the lonely realities of post-Brexit Britain. But in other countries such as Germany, the debate is quite similar. Can we still trust the Americans, or do we need to go it alone? And of course, for those EU member states that have been arguing that we need to develop a strategic autonomy, the Afghanistan debacle provides ammunition to support those arguments. And here I'm thinking in particular of France, and here I'm looking towards Helen on the screen, because perhaps that gives you also a cue to start with your opening remarks. And the way in which the European Union has responded collectively is rather underwhelming. And I think what I'd like to say is that last week, EU defense ministers met, EU foreign ministers met, and what they came up with was a déjà vu. They came up with proposals to improve the toolbox as far as security and defense is concerned, proposing a 5,000 troop strong rapid reaction force, and did not discuss strategy, did not discuss purpose. What would that have been for? Does that mean that the EU, we know that the EU has no intention whatsoever, and in fact, European NATO allies had no intention whatsoever of compensating for US withdrawal from Afghanistan. So what strikes me is the degree to which the response and the debate that this particular episode of the US withdrawal the NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan, how the debate is incommensurate with the actual challenge. What we have seen conversely is that Europeans started to panic. We saw the return of the 2015 dystopia, migration dystopia, Europe being invaded by millions of irregular migrants, as they were called, rather than rightful refugees and asylum seekers. That dominated the discussion and prevented Europe from building a more strategic position with respect to what it wants to achieve in the world. So on the one hand, you have the inability of the EU to craft a humane migration and asylum policy built in humanitarian values, to which we are bound by the Geneva Convention, and on the other hand, an inability at the same time to address security and the lack of political will to address conflict around the world. So if we're lacking these two dimensions, and the only response is a rather vacuous commitment to creating a rapid reaction force, which has already been created and never used, then it seems to me that the sort of essential elements for the EU to address future challenges, whatever they may be, we're lacking a capacity to analyze and reflect on current events and design comprehensive strategies that actually address those types of challenges. So there's a real mismatch between what is happening out there. And I've just taken Afghanistan, and I think it's just an example. It's not Europe's biggest strategic challenge at all. Those are others. But if even in this case, this is the response, it seems to me that our institutions and political leaders do not have the wherewithal to address the big issues that will define the future of Europe.
Thank you very much, Rosa. We'll come back to your analysis at the end to see whether other panelists agree with you as well, whether you're being over harsh or but just very realistic about the situation. And then turn to Helen. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yes, so hello everyone and thanks. And Rosa, I will come back to France actually, perhaps not on Afghanistan, but I confess that when I was sort of preparing for this, I've got many thoughts, and one of them is I'm probably quite literal, and I did start to think about Europe in the broader sense, and in fact what it means to me, and how it shaped my own identity really, sort of from the age of 11 when I bizarrely fell in love with French grammar, and I've reflected on how the EU has supported and facilitated sort of much of this engagement over the years. So I'm just sort of letting you into the kind of things I was thinking about, and also what I've lost professionally and personally, having been removed from the EU sort of through Brexit. But perhaps more sort of relevantly, I mused as well on the nagging sense that I have these days that to teach about the EU, particularly in the UK at the moment, or even to teach about Europe, I almost feel as if it's become something of a radical act, given the kind of ideological atmosphere at the moment in the UK around humanities in general, but in particular around Europe, and this sort of cursed or quest or clamouring for balance on any remotely politicised subjects. That's sort of, you know, those are sort of thoughts I've been having. Also, the fact that it becomes sort of, I feel that I have to justify that to be interested in Europe, let alone the EU, does not mean turning a blind eye to the wider world or global Britain for that matter. They're not binaries, even though, again, I feel that that's how we're being sort of channeled here in the UK. So when I was thinking about Europe, I did think about Europe in the broader sense than the European Union. And when I think about the future and the future of Europe, again, my mind immediately latched on to the things that kind of scare and excite me in equal measures, and that lead me to drive me to think about the sort of contributions hopefully I can make to our futures. And I'm thinking here not only of climate change, one of the ones that definitely keeps me awake at night, but also the sorts of technological developments that the brilliant UK writer Jeanette Winterson reflects on in her latest book, 12 Bytes, in which she explores in particular what artificial intelligence means for humankind, and the sorts of ways in which we might have to recalibrate, even in the next decade, what we deem as real, what we think about autonomy and privacy and so on. And I know that some of these matters are represented in the panel sessions of the conference, and it's great to see research in these areas. And of course, I'm aware that the European Union itself is engaged and will be, in its digital acts, and also that this will, that sort of the State of the Union address next week will feature these digital futures. But I guess I keep coming back to a slightly different version, I think, of Rosa, what I sort of took from yours, which is that these are all lacking in philosophical dimensions and philosophical frameworks. That's not surprising, but they're nevertheless lacking. And so, although I've spent a lot of time, a lot of years thinking about the EU and reflecting on it and teaching on it, when I think about the future of Europe, my mind does drift. Yes, I think about the EU, but it does go to these sort of broader dimensions. But having said that, maybe you'd rather I just sort of stuck to what I know about. And so, for academic as well as economic and social and political reasons, yes, the EU is squarely at the centre of these things. So where can I realistically deem myself an expert? Let me just give you then some additional thoughts, if that's okay, Paul, on the sort of areas that I'm working on at the moment. And the first is the case of France. So Rosa, thanks for that cue. And others can speak more cogently on Germany. So here I'm thinking about political leadership, I suppose, in general, because strategy, as Rosa sort of mentioned, if it's lacking, well, where does it come from? And the temptation is to think of our political leaders. So in the case of France, as most of you will know, I think France next year will hold its presidential and parliamentary elections. For Macron, maybe that's come around really quickly. I feel like it's come around quickly, or maybe it seemed like an eternity. So will Emmanuel Macron have been the third one-term president in a row? I think that's quite likely. It's probable and quite likely. And it is definitely too soon, right? I'm going to say this definitively. It is definitely too soon to make any sensible predictions about which candidates will make it through to the second round. I think we can confidently predict that no one candidate will win the first round with over 50%. We can observe the characters that do plan to stand, including the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, who I noticed in his early promises, he pledges to reprendre le contrôle, take back control. So clearly he did get brainwashed at some point. He mentioned that in relation to migration. We can watch the jostling, we can watch the primaries. There's 5 Green candidates, for example. But I think behind all of this, and I can go on about this at length, Paul, if you like, in the questions, I think we should remember that the French presidency, despite its extensive powers, is increasingly an exercise in raised expectations and dashed hopes. That's the first sort of thing I can say. Secondly, with regards to France, is Franco-German cooperation. So lots of people have written on how the tandem at the top is absolutely vital. And it's true that a change in chancellor and presidency in Germany and France, respectively, that's not really going to rock the boat of that bilateral. The bilateral has survived many changes at the top, but the bilateral itself seems to me rocky, both in substantive terms and also insufficient. So I just put that out there. Again, sort of trying to challenge the sort of things that we kind of like to talk about. And then I remembered that France next year will also hold the presidency of the EU in the first half of the year. I don't think that's going to go terribly smoothly with the change of French president sort of midway. They've got a rather interesting slogan: relaunch, power and belonging, or relance, puissance and appartenance. So perhaps I've mistranslated it, which is quite kind of enigmatic. Again, in terms of leadership and strategic thinking, I think we would be mistaken to perhaps put too much emphasis or hope on that as a source of sort of strategic direction. I'm not sure how much time I've got, but I also have so there's the French presidency of the EU and the French presidential elections. There's the Franco-German tandem. And then I've also been working with my French colleague Pauline Schnapper on Franco-British diplomacy after Brexit. Brexit has delivered a blow bigger than anything in living memory to the Franco-British relationship. France is finding itself having to take sides between the UK and the EU in many respects, and that's uncomfortable for the relationship. But it does have strong foundations, not only in security and defence. The UK has just sent its first ever female ambassador to Paris, Mena Rawlings, as she says, after 36 men in that post. As far as I'm aware, she's not Oxbridge either.
So 30 seconds, Helen, 30 seconds.
So the new Franco-British relationship, I think, is part and parcel of how the EU will reshape itself after Brexit. Finally, to come back to UACES with Quincy Chloe, another colleague, we've been looking at the role of subject associations in thinking about Europe. And thinking about how UACES as a subject association can support in the UK the endeavour of rethinking the UK's relationship with the EU at a time when teaching the EU in the universities is not that easy. So I'd just like to finish here really by thanking UACES, the staff, the officers and the committee for bringing the conference together and for this invitation. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. We'll come back to you, I'm sure, on your pessimism about Macron's chances of re-election and also your low level of expectation for the French presidency. I may put some pushback on that because the French tend to do rather good presidencies, at least historically. And of course, after the French presidential elections, as we all know on this panel, and in the audience, there'll be the culmination of the work of the Conference on the Future of Europe, which will also take place about a month after we know the result of the French presidential elections. Enough from me on this one. Over to you, Vincent, your turn.
Yes, thank you so much. And let me just say it's a real treat to be here on this panel with all of you and discussing these important topics. Maybe let me start off by saying that Europe for me really is a true love affair. I've been fortunate enough to travel to 29 European countries. I think I've been to all EU member states except 2. So I've met a lot of Europeans from very different backgrounds over the last 7 years that I've been doing work on European integration, interviewing particularly young people. And I absolutely believe in the European project. I also absolutely believe in the power of ideas to shape our society, to shape the system that we live in, to shape our world. Maybe let me start just one level bigger, kind of taking a little bit inspiration here from Helen, looking at maybe the bigger picture. I honestly believe that the world needs a strong, unified, democratic Europe on a number of issues, be it human rights, be it democracy, be it climate justice. I think Europe is extremely important. European innovation is important. European standards for human rights are very important. Larry Diamond describes something he calls the Democratic Recession we see since 2005 in countries around the world, including in Europe, where democracy declines, where levels of freedom decline. And I think in that kind of global context, Europe is extremely important, kind of as this beacon of liberty, freedoms, democracy, human rights, particularly also in regards to gender equality and so on and so forth. So I think that's kind of the global perspective. And I've studied 4 years in the United States. My wife is American. Our daughter is now American and German. So that gives me also a little bit this perspective of why Europe, or the idea of Europe, is so important in our time. I do think when we talk about Europe, of course, that's bigger than the European Union, but I think the European Union is our best shot at least right now, at kind of finishing this European project or moving forward with this European project. But that being said, the European Union has a lot of issues. There's a lot of trouble. There's a lot of problems facing it, and some have already been described here. When we look at foreign policy, Afghanistan, of course, has just shown that problem, but that problem has been known for a long time. I think the level of democracy on a European Union level is lacking, to say the least. I think that's one area where a lot needs to be done. But I think what I'm most interested in is finding ways and concrete ideas on how we can bring the European institutions, the European Union, closer to her citizens, how to make that connect significantly stronger than it is right now. Because what I've seen time and again when I do these travels and interviews in European Union member states is that a lot of people and a lot of young people feel extremely disconnected from the European project, from the European Union, from European institutions. And this is true for young people. This is true for older people throughout all generations. Eurostat says, for example, that 38% of EU citizens have never left their home country. And if you don't leave your home country, it's extremely difficult to feel that connection with the European Union, and so on and so forth. So that, with that in mind, me and my colleague Martin, who I work a lot with, we have actually recently collected a lot of ideas, 95 total, that we have found on our travels, that we have come across when talking with stakeholders and experts on how to improve the European Union. And there's a major chapter on this identity building, on this bringing the European Union closer to her citizens. I just want to end maybe with highlighting the one initiative I've been most closely occupied with the last years, the free interrail idea, this proposal to provide all EU citizens a free interrail ticket upon turning 18. The idea not just being to give young Europeans a good vacation time, but particularly to really strengthen European integration, to enable this cross-cultural exchange of people, of ideas, to kind of break down stereotypes, and really foster European identity. I think that's extremely important. So when we talk about the future of Europe, I think the first step that we really have to tackle is how to make people feel the European Union, how to feel connected to it, how to feel connected to people who are not from their home country. And bridging these cultural divides, sometimes these political divides, is extremely important. I think there are great ideas out there. As I said at the beginning, I believe in the power of ideas. These ideas are out there. Now the European Union needs to muster the courage, if you will, to think boldly again, to think maybe a little bigger than they have, or the European institutions have in the last 10, 20 years, to kind of revive this, maybe the spirit of the 1950s again, of Schuman and so on and so forth. That's kind of a little bit where I'm standing. So we can go into some of the details later in the discussion, but maybe that's a good introduction from my side.
Thank you very much, Vincent. This is, not a new debate. I think everybody on the panel and everybody watching will know that the EU has been struggling to connect with the citizens since its inception, and we can argue maybe about the analysis. Well, is it about connecting with the European Commission, or is it maybe also about holding people to account on producing outcomes rather than being close to a European Commission official? Or we'll see. We'll have a discussion about that, I'm sure, when we've all finished our introductory remarks. Shada, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And be here. Thank you, UACES, for inviting me to this very exciting. So, Paul, you've probably heard me say this before, but I often describe myself as an accidental European. I was born in Asia, bred in Europe. Passionate European. I really do, like Vincent has said, believe in this project. And I think in today's world, with all the challenges we face, this is important as a mitigating force, especially as we go towards intensified geopolitical tensions between the US and China. But I'm also, like many here on the panel, quite depressed at the state of Europe today, and the powerlessness and the voicelessness of Europe today worries me. Let me give you a few ideas of why I feel slightly depressed these days. It's not just the pandemic. I feel that we're backsliding on European values, our identity issues, and the narrative of Europe is becoming very toxic. Now, when the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, she talked about creating a Europe that was more equal, more humane, and more fair. She talked about a union of equality, and then went ahead and nominated a wonderful man as protector, promoting the European way of life. So I think she started off by saying two very mixed signals, because say what European way of life, it has been right, and the populace and her determination to proceed with criticism, I think, was to the far right. Did she know this, or was she just being? I would say the same difference. The message went out, and Vincent talked about being disconnected. This is what I think she sent very negative to citizens about what this Europe was, and it excluded, and I would say 50 million Europeans of color from that connection that you wanted to install with the European way of life. And then, you know, we focused a lot on the pandemic, but we've also had a phenomena which is not just restricted to the United States. We've had Black Lives Matter. And this, I think, has been something that Europeans have not really focused on, although for us, Europeans of color, and the allies that we have across Europe, this has been a very important move. It has had impact, I have to say, here in Brussels. We've had some reaction from the European Commission, from the EU institutions, a sudden interest in diversity beyond gender, which I'm a firm believer in, but also about inclusion, to include Europeans of color in their conversations, discussion about Brussels so wide becoming, hopefully one day, Brussels diverse. But the message, and I say that we have a now outrage at the erosion of European values. So we're very, very angry about the East-West divide, very sort of less prescriptive when it comes to Eastern, Central, and Eastern Europe, whether it's Poland, whether it's Hungary, and a lot of talk about that, and rightly so. What's happening there and erosion of values is something that's very detrimental to Europe. But what's happening in the West and about erosion of our values when it comes to attacks on Muslims, when it comes to attacks on people of color, and racist diatribes, etc., from some of our mainstream political leaders, there is no outrage and there is no call out from Brussels. So there's also an element which I find very, very disturbing. It's somehow been reduced, racism is being reduced to bigots and nasty apples, if you like, in the crate, and not realizing that institutional racism, unconscious bias, systemic racism is very light on this development of a Europe that I love. I find that Fortress Europe is now the dominant narrative, and that's sort of steering our discussions rather than this union of values. So Fortress Europe has now become the mainstay of this Europe. And if you talk to people outside, this is the image of Europe. So how can we stand on the global stage and be a geopolitical Europe which tries to influence events? We cannot be global leaders. I don't think there can be a global leader in today's very diverse world, but we can have a say in the shaping or the reshaping of this world. But Europe is, because of the tragedies that happen in our camps, so people trying to reach and not being able to find homes here. Obviously, we need a better immigration policy. We're not getting there. And I think it really is a stain. Very quickly, if I may, on Afghanistan and geopolitical Europe. I was born in that region, so what's been happening in the few months, but actually 20 years, if not 40 years, is very, very depressing for someone like me. It's shocking, it's alarming, and it feels like a betrayal. It feels like a real personal betrayal. And there again, what are we seeing? And Rosa has talked about it. What are we seeing at the moment? We're seeing, once again, everything being driven by Fortress Europe and this paradigm that is the dominant conversation. Keep out the hordes. Actually, most of these, not the ones who've been sort of in the mainstream Western media, most of the refugees are going to either Pakistan or Iran. And nobody actually talks about it. I think the second point that we really need to learn a lesson, and it's a repeated thing that is our over-dependence on the United States. And there the idea Macron is talking about open strategic autonomy. I mean, I think we just need to pursue this further. It doesn't have to be only in the military and the security sector. It is a question of mindsets. We can stand on our own 2 feet as a European. I'm proud of that. And I hope we can achieve that. The third thing I would say about Afghanistan that worries me now is our double standards. We have to absolutely come to the defense of Afghan women and girls. And we know the Taliban cannot be trusted when it comes to the promises or the commitments they're making at the moment. But can I tell you, Paul, how shallow we sound when we're shouting about Afghan women and children, and we are not talking about the well-documented discrimination against Muslim women across Europe, and especially, if I say, at the moment. We say, so once again, we're accused of double standards and hypocrisy. And finally, I'd say that we have to keep Afghanistan on the radar. It's not just because the Americans have left or the NATO has left that Europeans can drop this very strategically important country, but also which faces a humanitarian crisis at the moment. And we have to focus on that and not just on Fortress Europe. Fortress Europe is a big obstacle to inclusive Europe and a big obstacle to geopolitical Europe. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Shada. That's quite a charge sheet, and it's a kind of balance to what Vincent's saying about where we want people to connect, especially young people. But connect to what? Connect to a Europe which is functioning, which is not racist or has double standards. And I very much like your phrase, selective outrage. We'll come back to that as well, I'm sure, in a moment. Last but not least, as I always say on these occasions, Brigid, over to you. Brigid, if you could unmute, Brigid, that would be helpful. If you could unmute, bottom left-hand corner, the green one.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
So good afternoon, everyone. And obviously, there have already been 4 interventions. And I think that's told us that this is a very messy subject and that the future of Europe is unknown and unknowable and highly contested. And that's not likely to change anytime soon. I think we sometimes apply, when we look at the EU, we run to judgment on events very quickly. And we tend not to take a deeper historical perspective about what polity building, what it is, how messy it is through history, and how difficult and challenging it is through history. And we tend to think, in my view, the EU is always destined to disappoint because it will never, ever, given its structural nature, it will always struggle in conflicts about values and interests. And I think it's important, politicians, and they're the ones who have to take responsibility, who are elected to take responsibility, they must always try to manage tensions between values and interests. And I think it is apolitical to think that it's just only about values and always about values. It is also about interests. In fact, politics is about conflict and how you solve very deep and big conflicts. So sometimes I think I'm always wary of overstating the values and understating interests and the messiness of politics, because I'm an analyst, I'm an academic, I sit on the sidelines. I don't sit at a ministerial desk. I'm not answerable to the people. I'm not held accountable in elections. So I actually think it's a tough thing to be a politician in any democracy in the world today, and particularly also in Europe. We're in a period of very fractured and fragmented politics with high levels of uncertainty and contingency. So I think my plea would be for us to think about just how messy nation state building was, how conflicted it was, and how challenging and difficult it was, and how unfinished it was in many instances. So in other words, politics is a messy business, and the making of Europe, this EU, is also full of conflict and full of conflict and full of challenge. Politics is about the way in which those challenges can legitimately be processed, and that matters then what the views of the electorates, and those views differ. The political spectrum differs, the interests differ, etc., etc. I think the EU is also inevitably always unfinished, because it's quite an experimental polity, and it's relatively young at this stage. When it comes to the future, I think the future of Europe will be determined much more in terms of what happens wider geopolitics, the relationship with the US, the China-US relationship, and how that conflict and competition works its way out, the stability of Africa and the near neighborhood. And I think we also need to take seriously the danger in our world of what's been called weaponized interdependence. And we see that at the borders of Europe already. So Lukashenko at the moment is using migrants and refugees politically. He's using them in order to make in part of his geopolitical conflict with the EU. So I think that it's polities need boundaries and borders, and I think, Shada, Europe is also entitled to boundaries and borders. It's, and every polity has boundaries and borders, and those boundaries are frequently boundaries of exclusion, and Europe is not distinctive in that. So again, I think that I would challenge you on precisely what you mean by Fortress Europe, because it's something that is used very frequently. It came up in the single market. Europe would be a fortress, etc., etc. In fact, there is, in terms of the flows of people, then I think one has to look very carefully at the empirics of that. I think on what I would call the supply and demand for governance, I think we know where the demands are. The demands across the world are pretty clear. Our world, including Europe, must tackle the climate crisis. It must tackle the economic transformation in terms of digitalization, the future of work, social justice, and equity within our societies. And Europe is also challenged with its place in the world, what it can aspire to be, and what it can achieve, and what is realistic, because it's very dangerous for politics to have expectations that far out that where the reach is much greater than the capacity to achieve. So my plea is for a recognition of the messiness of politics, of the unfinished and messy nature of the EU, and its future will be determined in many ways by how it can get sufficient collective capacity to be able to address the problems it faces, and also to be a force for more good than bad in the world. But I don't think the EU is, I really always resisted the normative power Europe definition of the EU in the world, because I thought it did not confront the fact that Europe, when it comes to trade, etc., also plays power and interests. So I think that's my plea. My plea is for a recognition of the messy nature of politics.
Thank you very much, Brigid. I will now engage with the panel a bit and do some forensic analysis of what you've all been saying. I've been taking copious notes very surreptitiously with my right hand. Just before I do that, I want to remind the audience to put questions in the chat, and I'm promised by Emma that she will forward them to us so that the panel can see them as well. So we'll be turning to your questions in a few moments. What struck me, with the possible exception of Emanuel's intervention, was that none of you have spoken about the kind of the traditional historic core competences or core objectives of the EU in the old days: the single market, economic issues, regulation, antitrust supervision, all those kind of things. And we're talking about, to say a brave new world is inaccurate, of course, and not the right way to describe it, but about foreign security policy, Europe in the world. And although European foreign security policy and the wider and in its broadest definition is not a new thing, nonetheless, it seems that at the moment, and as Rosa said at the very, very beginning, Afghanistan is just the latest example of that, is that EU is struggling. It knows, it feels it wants to have a role in the world, but it does not know how to go about it. And amongst many things, Shada mentioned many things that Ursula von der Leyen said at the beginning of her mandate almost 2 years ago now, but she did also, as we all know, talk about a geopolitical commission. She didn't actually talk about a geopolitical EU, I think. She talked about a geopolitical commission, which is an interesting difference. But it seems that people expect the EU to do more on the world stage. At the same time, it either hasn't got the tools, hasn't got the single definition or consensus on what that means, and is being criticized left, right, and center. So I just wonder whether any of you having major opening interventions feel that you've been overcritical, or do you stand by what you said, and it will, because if you do stand by what you're saying, which I'm sure you probably will, what needs to change? Otherwise, we'll be having these kind of conversations forever. The EU not up to the task. Who wants to go first? Well, Rosa, we'll go back in the order of the opening interventions. You mentioned Afghanistan, Rosa, as an example, but I know we did a podcast together not so long ago. This is one of many examples where the EU is not doing what it could do or should do. So explain, amplify.
Yeah, no, I still stand by what I said, although I guess it's partially a bit of, I think, Shada, you mentioned depression, at just the continuous reiteration of the same debates. Whenever there is a discussion on the EU's capacity to act in the world, we go back to, maybe we should pull together some armed forces. And, it's repetitive to say, well, to do what? And so it's that poverty of debate, which is a bit frustrating. And that's the reflection on current affairs today and on how it speaks of deeper problems. And I mentioned the dystopian reaction to the 2015 influx of refugees, which I think at the moment is a real factor for political paralysis in the EU. Having said this, and this I didn't say in my opening remarks, but I guess I took it for granted, I do actually think that for all its faults and all its problems, the EU is actually very well equipped to deal with 21st century complexity, because it is undefined, because it has to share competences with the member states, because it has constructed this admittedly complex institution that, and if you look at it together with the member states, if you look at it together with the regions of Europe and the smaller communities of Europe, if you take a broader look at what Europe is and the institutions it has built, it is multi-level and multi-dimensional, which is, these are precisely the kind of attributes that you need to deal with challenges such as the climate crisis, because the climate crisis is as much to do with, managing green spaces in cities as it is taking on fossil fuel, the economic sector, fossil fuel producers, and designing or regulating a different type of international capitalism which will mitigate the effects of the climate crisis. So we've got to do both these things. And Europe is better placed than anywhere to deal with this. And I think, you know, for all the problems we've been observing on a daily basis how to respond to the pandemic, compare Europe with, and the jury's still out there, who performed better. But in many respects, Europe didn't do that badly. You know, again, after, what is it now, 20 months of this, didn't do quite that badly. And in some respects, you know, did better than the US. And in other respects, I mean, China's not a democracy, so I don't really consider it's, you know, I don't consider China as a comparison to Europe. But it's because of the complexity. So you can have, you know, a presence, a local presence, but you can also have a voice. You know, it's market of 500 million people. You can have a voice in the big settings. So this what needs to be done more. And here I'd like to refer to what Vincent was saying about democracy. It's not just about adapting the EU institutions so that there's more accountability. It's about injecting a greater and reforming democracy at the local level, at the national level, and at the EU level, and then try and project these as insofar as it is possible to the multilateral level as well, the international level. And if you work on all these dimensions, then I think that's where the key to the future of Europe lies. And in this particular case, I do want to emphasize that I think, I firmly believe that this has to be done in connection with the rest of the world. It has to be done because Europe is immersed in the rest of the world, and not by building fortresses or closing off communities. Okay. So that's, you know, something. Right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to that, I'm sure. Thank you, Rosie. And all of you, I know, know so much. It's difficult to stop you because you have so much to share with us. Helen, I'd like to talk to you, but I won't, about the challenges of teaching students, the messiness of the EU, as Brigid says. But I want to instead ask you about Macron. Okay, I'm not going to argue with you about whether he's going to be a 1 or 2 term French president, but I do want to ask you what you think about his contribution to explain in many ways, linking to what Vincent said about democracy and the point of Europe on the one hand, and the messiness that Brigid talks about, and the multi-layer complexity that Rosa talks about. He's trying to explain to the French electorate, essentially, but also to the Anglophone media, what Europe's about. He's the only leader since a long, long time, and probably the only leader probably ever, to try and explain what the EU is for, what it should be doing, what it should not be doing. And do you agree that that's how he'll be seen as and when he leaves the Elysee?
Okay, thanks for that. You're right. I mean, I agree with you, Paul, on that analysis. And I think even some of Macron's detractors would agree that he has been, his diagnosis, if you like, sort of his geopolitical diagnosis, generally, is quite sharp, and he has been able, and he does have the ability to express himself, as you say, and to reach out and so on. But I don't think that's what he'll be remembered for in France, whether he's 1 term or 2 term. He's kind of been blighted, or he's blighted himself. He has made a whole load of tactical errors. He wasn't experienced at governing. He hasn't been experienced at governing, at sort of putting together governing coalitions, even sort of the party and so on that he nominally heads. So I mean, the reason that I found him of interest, or one of the reasons, and the things that I've written about in his respect, are to do with his geopolitical analysis. I don't think he's wrong. You know, when he said that NATO was undergoing a more cerebral, he just meant that it wasn't, you know, the so-called the infamous brain dead comment. He was trying to say, as far as I understood, that it was a failure of sort of imaginative thinking, and a failure of innovative thinking, and a failure or an unwillingness to think outside the box. But because he puts things so undiplomatically, and because at home, and I guess I can go on about this like for weeks, but you know, because at home he's been blighted by a number of associations, a number of stereotypes, a number of sentiments, and so on. and also because for some of his detractors, because he is associated with the so-called global elite, which can have more or less noxious sort of sinister meanings. But he is very much associated with that. And so he is, for many in France, he is totally disconnected from their world, their lives and their aspirations. And what he says about geopolitics doesn't really sort of, they couldn't care less in a way. So there is that's my answer. That's my answer really to that.
On the brain dead thing, just very briefly, my own take on that, but it's worth it, that wasn't a slip of the tongue. That was quite deliberate. If you read the transcript of the interview, he repeats it at the very end as well, just to make sure that the interviewers noted the expression. It wasn't just came out of the blue.
That's right. I agree.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just make one more comment?
Please do. Go ahead.
Sort of still perhaps relating to France, there is I don't know if I say it's a big problem. There is the problem of the euro, and one of the things I mean by that is that there's fairly sort of extensive, legitimate, respectable, if you like, intellectual reflection on the problems of the euro and the sort of the impact it's had, the eurozone, on the French economy. I mean, and I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to get dragged into that, but there's a discourse about that, and it has fed some of the sort of the more extremists or some of Macron's opponents on the left and the right. And there is sort of a respectability, if you like, around the fact that perhaps the euro is the EU's problem, or is that. And Brigid Granville at Queen Mary has written quite interestingly about this, that scrapping the euro or redesigning the euro could perhaps save the EU. Well, I'm not going to get dragged into that, but it's a live debate in France, and that will play out again next year. And just a final thing, sort of listening to you, or not so much about France, even though that is my favourite subject, I guess, is it just strikes me, sort of listening to Rosa just now as well, is in some ways the way I kind of experience a lot of the things that are happening now is like there has to be a big letting go, and it's about power, whether it's white men and their power, and I'm overgeneralizing here with no desire to give offense, but to sort of take a shortcut, or leaders, in the case of the French presidency, in sort of typically deferential, authoritative positions. There's a whole series of ways in which it's going to have to be, or there will be some kind of, it's not a very technical term, a big sort of letting go of the levers of power. And I think, so within the EU, change is going to come, whether we like it or not, from the member states, from other actors, from the tech giants, from unintended consequences of innovations and so on. And so I think Vincent's on the right lines when you say, Vincent, about sort of, the EU needs to be relevant to its people. I too think it's Europe's best shot. That's we won't get on to, I won't get on to Brexit
Okay.
now. No. But so this isn't a criticism of the EU. I think it is the only shot. But change can't come from above, I don't think, or not. It won't be sufficient. And to sort of re-inject, I think, was it Rosa, you said, talk about re-inject energy and kind of democracy at other levels. I can't really see a way around that. It's part of letting go of the status quo of who holds power, and I'll stop there.
Okay. If there's a shattering silence from the audience and there are no questions, I promise you we will come to Brexit, but only if there are no questions from the audience. Back to you, Vincent. You use the phrase, we need a strong, unified, democratic Europe, and it's great. And of course, I'm an old, cynical old man, I've been around, old white man, maybe, as Helen might say, been around too long. But this is wonderful to hear, but this is not, as I said in my reaction to your opening remarks, this is not a new debate, and EU has been struggling to connect since it's almost its inception. So every time there's a European Parliament election, the turnout is derisory, doesn't seem to go up, despite the attempt at the Spitzenkandidaten idea, and so on and so on. Huge amounts, as you know, as we all know on this panel, devoted from the EU budget to communicating Europe, left, right, and centre, and still there is this disconnect. So how do we go about bringing the citizens to connect more with the EU, Vincent? In a concrete idea.
That's a very, very big question. First of all, I was really listening to all of the other points here. It's really interesting, and definitely I feel very honored to be here in this group and hearing all these very important points. To your question, first of all, I don't think the EU is spending as much as it should and could on communications. If you really kind of break it down on what it spends per citizen, I think it's just 50 cents or something like that a year. So I think it could definitely increase that budget. But the question is, how do you increase it, right? For example, there are all these European information offices or Europe Direct offices, and when you walk in them, they're mostly empty. And they have wonderful brochures, they have wonderful materials, but very few people actually read it. So I think at the end of the day, it comes down to a natural experience. And this is where we originally came from with our free interrail proposal, that it's really difficult to explain the benefit of European integration or the European project through a school book. It's very difficult to tell a young person who has never left their country why the European project is important, but it's easier to show them. And so this is why I strongly believe in the power of exchange programs. I strongly believe in cross-border travel. I strongly believe in mobility really as a key to building that identity and bringing people together. And free interrail is just one proposal of how that could work. As far as I know, this is still the cheapest, most effective proposal that I've heard of so far, to just provide interrail tickets to 18-year-olds. It costs about 1 billion euros a year. That sounds like a lot, but that's just a minuscule amount when you compare it to the common agricultural policy and so on and so forth. So I mean, like, and that would enable every 18-year-old to travel outside their home country. So this is a concrete idea. But I think just if I may open just a debate or kind of get back to Brigid on her opening intervention, the question about interest and values, which I find a fascinating debate. And I'm actually just curious, Brigid, to hear your thoughts a little bit more on this, because I personally feel when we talk about the European Union, we don't talk about values enough, that mostly it's about interests. And that when I and my colleague, when we have traveled on Interrail and interviewed people, for the most part, when we ask them, why do you like the European Union or why do you like your country being part of it, you get a very realpolitik kind of answer. So in some countries, they talk about the economic benefits, the structural funds being brought into their country from the EU. And then in other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, when you go to the Baltic countries, people talk about security, mostly from Russian intervention. So they see the EU more as a kind of a security apparatus or something like that. And this all is great and it makes sense. And I mean, the original European project started as an economic project. It didn't start as a value project. It started as the simple idea of we want to prevent war between Germany and France, and we'll just intertwine the economies so it becomes impossible. So it's also kind of realpolitik, economic kind of perspective. I personally feel the debate on values falls short all the time. That in theory, you know, when you look at the treaty on the European Union in Article 2, I believe it says all in like democracy and liberty and freedom of the individual and so on and so forth. But what I think we're really missing, and this is another concrete idea, is a constitution kind of also, and the constitution requires a big debate as European Union member states. What are the values that we hold central, and what are the values where we also draw a red line, where we say this is we go this far but not any further? And the current debate shows this, right? The way the European Union deals with migrants or refugees or asylum seekers at the border, this absolutely defies any kind of sense of human rights. The way how in some countries there are LGBT-free zones, how gender equality is not a thing in any European Union member state, and so on and so forth. So there are all these points where the European Union falls short on values. But I think this could be the big strength of the European Union, that particularly in this world today, the United States has kind of retreated a little bit as the beacon for values, if you will, at least in my personal opinion. And other countries have slowly slid into autocracy in some parts of the world. But then values really remains kind of the big unique selling point of the European Union. So I would like to see much more debate on that. I would like to see something like the Conference on the Future of Europe turn into an actual attempt to redraft the European Constitution and kind of settle, maybe not settle forever, but kind of for now come to a stronger conclusion. What are our shared values? Because I think at the end of the day, that will be very important. I hope this just made sense.
No, I just hope that you don't sort of open a can of worms of that and see, and I hope you get the result you want if you were to have your way, Vincent. I mean, it strikes me, you mentioned the point, and I'm thinking of Luc van Middellaar's last book, L'Europe qui improvise, the French title, many different language versions out there, where he makes the kind of such an obvious point, but it is so important that different member states have joined the EU for different reasons. And that is fundamental to why this messiness that Brigid keeps talking about. I mean, you join a tennis club because you want to play tennis, full stop. You join the EU as a member state and you have lots of different reasons, and then you have different expectations, and you haven't necessarily got the same values, which is my cue. I will come back to you, Brigid, because you can respond to Vincent's invitation to talk about that, values against interest in a second. But before that, I want to keep the order, otherwise I'll lose my place, with Shada. Shada, you said you were quite depressed, and you're succeeding in maybe depressing some of us as well, and talking about the powerlessness and the voicelessness, but you also sounded, I know you quite well, you sound quite angry as well. And I just, without making this too much of an ad hominem or feminine point, you did refer to Ursula von der Leyen more than once in your opening intervention, the things she said at the very beginning, and how you're concerned about that. Because do you think that is still the case? I asked the question that she still basically thinks that way, and people around her think that way. I asked the question because, there was chit-chat in this town that you and I live in, and Rosa called Brussels, where she may be angling maybe even for a second term. So we may have potentially 8 years of Ursula von der Leyen as President of the European Commission, in which case what she thinks and what her values are seems to be quite important.
Absolutely, Paul. I think thank you. Yeah, I think she is learning as she works, and I think her response to Black Lives Matter in terms of what she has done, in terms of having an anti-racism summit, for the first time, Europe has an anti-racism coordinator, whatever that means, coordinator. But the fact is that this person, a fantastic Finnish Black woman, will throughout the policy sectors of the European Union Commission, and try to make sure that anti-racism principles, values, and human rights are sort of mainstream objective. I wish her luck, and I think she's very, very capable of doing so. So, and she has, I think Ursula von der Leyen is working very hard in terms of recruiting beyond the usual suspects and going beyond the Brussels so white. I think she's got a diversity and inclusion officer in the External Action Service within the European Commission as well. So I think her heart is in the right place. But my problem is that she's torn between her conservative roots, that of her party, and her own instincts, which I think are very much more inclusive and pro-diversity than she shows. But the outrage that I talk about is that when you're in Brussels, you're constantly, Paul, don't get me wrong, hearing about the erosion of liberties, LGBTIQ rights, freedom of media in Eastern and Central Europe, and rightly so. Once again, this is what's happening is from the European Commission, anything against erosion of human rights when it comes to become Muslims, etc., in the West, and we blatant, let's say, backsliding on rights and values in, say, Austria, say, France. We don't hear that. And, there's a political reason for that. I'm not denying that, but it's just selective outrage. We're very angry about Muslims, the Uyghurs in China, less so about what's happening in many other parts of Asia when it comes to Muslims as well. So we have instinctive selective outrage or ethnic minorities elsewhere. But let me just come back, if you'd allow, to 3 or 4 questions that have been raised. I think Brigid said very rightly, everybody has boundaries and borders, and I have always talked about good borders. I haven't said throw open Europe to every asylum seeker. That would be absolutely self-defeating. But boundaries and borders, and the European Union, along with NATO, the boundaries and borders of other countries as well. And as we've seen, in many cases, that has not been the case. About borders and boundaries are mental elements as well, mindsets, and our mindsets are Eurocentric approaches to foreign security policy, migration policy. We have a colonial overhead about this for EPC, how colonial imperialistic instincts still influence our foreign security, trade, development policy. Tony has talked about this as well. And we have an instinctive, I'm sorry to say this, it sounds really, really rude, but I have to call it out, Orientalist tropes that are immediately visible when we're talking about brown men versus brown women, or Muslims coming to Europe, or every Muslim being a potential terrorist. I mean, these are heavily ingrained and anchored in the European narrative, and nobody calls them out. There is a groupthink happening inside Europe, which I think really is not doing us any good. All of this that I'm saying is something that is basically because I think Europe can do better, where Europe is doing very, very well. First of all, on China, I think the European policy on China, which is basically to find a third way of doing things, not following model, God forbid, or the American model, but a standalone policy on China. I think this is very good. We can talk about it. Also, other countries in Asia, specific strategy of the EU that will be coming out will be very different from the American, the French, or the much EU focus. And I think a lot of cooperation and collaboration are part of it. And I think that is very, very important. A third point I want to say, Paul, is trauma of 2015 when Syrian refugees came to Europe. Most of them have settled very well. Most of them are doing either internships or have jobs. And we never talk about the success stories. We never say needs migrants. Aging Europe needs migrants. And that story is hardly ever told, but or by our media. And finally, Vincent's point about how, and you asked how we can. I have two suggestions. First of all, I think we revitalize our democracy by engaging young people. Vincent said it. Two ways of doing it. First of all, lower the voting age for the European Parliament from 18 to 16. Get the real young people involved in determining next politicians of Europe. And secondly, get electronic voting. I can tell you many more people will vote electronically. That we do everything electronically, that will bring rejuvenation, if you like, of the European nation, in the rejuvenation in its own way of its own nation. I'm joking there. That is what we need for democracy to flourish. Bring in the younger voices, and let's not talk about the citizens of tomorrow, they're the citizens of today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shada. I turn to you, Brigid. First of all, I'd like you to, maybe to respond to Vincent's invitation, talk about this balance between values and interests, but also maybe respond also, if you wouldn't mind, to what Rosa said in her second intervention about how, on a more positive note, she was striking how the EU is actually rather well placed to tackle 21st century problem because of its complexity, because of its multi-layered levels of decision making and deliberation. Maybe you could respond to that as well as part of your intervention.
So firstly, on the values and interests, the values that formally and constitutionally the EU aspires to, we know them, and they are entrenched in a constitutional document. It happens to be a treaty, but those values have been constitutionalized by the Court of Justice. I would be horrified if the Conference on the Future of Europe pursued Vincent's suggestion to make it all about values and try and get us a new constitution. Number one, there probably wouldn't be agreement on why are the treaties so complex. They're complex because you're asking member states to submit to each other and to become vulnerable. Their legal systems, their administrative systems, and their political systems. They will only do that if there is a scaffolding, a treaty scaffolding. It is not and cannot be appropriate at this stage of the EU's development to have a short constitutional document, because that leaves far too much uncertain, and the member states just simply wouldn't go there. But I think it could be disintegrative. I think it could be extremely dangerous. Then if we have, if the Conference on the Future of Europe could come to an agreement on a new constitution, and remember we had that wonderful experiment in the mid-2000s, it would not be ratified. I think we've got to accept that this is really messy, and we've got to, I've always thought that the EU is threatened by that part of Euroscepticism that's phobic. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to be against the EU as a project. It's a political project. It is perfectly reasonable to say, I do not value or like this project. But there is that phobic element of Euroscepticism, which is, I just want to tear it all down. But interestingly, I think the EU can also be threatened by those who would push the system in a federal direction beyond which it has the capacity to handle. So in my view, I tend to be a constitutional conservative in this, and I tend to think one should be extremely careful in driving what is an experiment and relatively fragile and thinly institutionalized system beyond its capacity to survive. So I actually, on that, on the point I was making on the values and interests is, so in the literature on the EU's role in the world, normative power Europe became the dominant, one of the dominant concepts about the way Europe was in the world. And I always, and there was an undertone of, we're the nice guys, we're not the Americans. I just thought it was organized hypocrisy, because the EU pursues its hard interests in trade, just like the Americans. And so I thought that it was, and of course the Commission loved the idea of normative power Europe because we're the good guys, or what. So that's where I challenge it. I think there's been a very, and Shada is absolutely right to talk about the discriminatory outrage, but I do think that we must be very outraged at what's happening in countries that member states of the EU that are no longer democratic. I think that given the link of membership to democracy, then for me, Orban's Hungary is way beyond the pale. And I think it was really good that at the European Council, most of his counterparts around the table really did turn on Orban. And it was one of the few times when the European Council became a very impolite body. And in my view, it should have more politics and less politeness more often. And they finally responded to Orban. On how well placed the EU is for all of those challenges, I think Rosa's right. I think that the EU has a capacity to be adaptive and flexible, but I don't think we have even begun to grapple with the transformation required to deal with the climate crisis. And I think that, in fact, one of the things that I hope from the Conference on the Future of Europe is not a whole lot of woolly recommendations, but rather a pedagogical exercise for all of us in confronting what are these big societal transformations that must be confronted. And so I would hope that Europe is well placed to deal with the climate, to be transformative on the climate agenda, on the green agenda. But I think that we have a long, long way to go. And of course, it comes up against we all want a green world. I'm not sure we're all ready to change even our own lifestyles to deliver it. So I hope Europe is ready for this, and that it will manage to come up with both the policies but also the politics to support it, and do it in a legitimate and just way. But I'm not sure. But then I'm not sure our world is ready for what's required to tackle the climate crisis.
Right. Thank you, Brigid. Well, you and Vincent have mentioned the Conference on the Future of Europe, but maybe others as well. Forgive me if I've left you out, but let's have a very brief discussion about that. I mean, we all know how it was. The idea originally was again Emmanuel Macron. He wanted to be a much bigger event, exercise spanning 2 years. We all know about the politics. I don't want the last 15 minutes of our discussion to be dominated by the politics of that, but nonetheless, what expectations that you on the panel have on the Conference on the Future of Europe? Is it a platform for a sensible debate, for connecting with the citizens, as Vincent would like to have, or is it going to be rather a damp squib, frankly, who wants to quickly pitch in on their views on the Conference on the Future of Europe? Maybe Helen, Rosa, or Shada, who have not talked about it very much until now. Helen, over to you.
I haven't talked about it much because I haven't thought about it much.
So if that's your answer, fine.
That's a confession. It's not something that I've really thought that much about. So I'd be interested to know from the rest of you how much hope we can put in it. The thought that comes into my mind, I suppose, is sort of similar to COP26. You know, how inclusive will it be? How environmentally friendly will it be? How well will it work incorporating a virtual dimension? How well can it model the sort of the sort of communication or the sorts of how can it model a good way to hold conversations in an inclusive sort of semi-virtual fashion? That's the sort of thing that I'd be interested in seeing. You know, who's going to be there, who's excluded, and how much will it cost in the genuine sense of the term for it to occur. So those are the sorts of questions I'd have around it.
It may not be your top topic, Shada or Rosa, but any views about, because Ralph Drakenberg asked the question, I should have mentioned his name. Any views?
Well, I just think, I think, you know, our expectations have been lowered over time. You know, the conference started late. One of the first things, the institutional leaders quarreling to get a place on the podium, etc., etc. So I think expectations are low. But I have to say that I agree with Brigid on the risks of seeking some treaty reform or constitutionalizing the EU. What I'd like to see from the conference really is, I think its value will be more in process than in outcomes. And if we can get conversations going, if we can get national traditional media to look at, to tell stories about Europe, and if in that process, which it would be messy, which would be interactive, it doesn't necessarily need to lead anywhere, but it can be a sort of living experience. And if in that process we learn something about accompanying our representative democracies and technocratic institutions with deliberation processes, consultation processes, a bit more direct democracy experiments, I think that could be quite useful in finding some ideas on how we can reform our democracies. Because as I mentioned, I think at some point, it's not just about the democratic deficit and the relationship between Parliament, Council, and the Commission. It's really about rethinking democracy at all levels. And if this can provide some useful examples of how do you do it with 500 million people, that might be interesting. I think we need to think about how we can combine the need for technocratic knowledge, the need for representative democracy with more participative processes. And maybe the conference could give us some indication on that.
Okay. All right, let's move on. My view, for what it's worth, it may be a missed opportunity. I'm not normally a pessimist, but there's so many politicians claiming speaking slots in this conference, both MEPs and national MPs, and relatively little space given to what we might like to call citizens, real people. So we'll see. Let's not prejudge. I want to devote the last 9 minutes of our discussion to the following, and so you'll have a couple of minutes each maximum, no more than that, which is, it's not Brexit per se, but after Brexit happened, of course, there was this discussion, briefly at least, about whether there'd be other member states queuing up to leave the European Union. Of course, that hasn't happened. So a lot of pro-Europeans, the more ardent ones, and we're all pro-European, as you see, that was a one-off thing. It was suicidal for the UK. It's not to be repeated by the member states. But maybe what we do have maybe a situation where some member states, and you know who I'm talking about, are very keen now to stay in because they can see which side their bread is buttered. But they are creating havoc and disharmony whilst remaining members. So I'd like any of you to talk about that. What you think about the internal cohesion of the EU post-Brexit, and if anybody wants to do a kind of separate point, which I'd like to raise very briefly, is we haven't talked about it at all. What the EU will be like now that the United Kingdom has finally left. So you can either talk about the internal cohesion of the EU post-Brexit or the impact on the EU of the departure of the UK. And we'll go through the order again. So Rosa, and then down the line. Rosa, you can choose to answer either of those questions, maybe not both.
Right, difficult one, because I would like to answer both. No, but you know, Paul, you and I have been talking a lot about Brexit, and I am one of those who believes that it has a negative impact on the EU in terms of altering the balance of power within the EU and the sort of decision-making processes and the synthesis that Britain provided to the EU, especially on foreign policy matters. And we still haven't found that new balance. And I think we're going to have to inevitably wait for the outcome of the elections in Germany and then in France in order to see what kind of new balance will shape up. I think, and this is interesting, the Afghanistan debacle also shows how things are not easy for the UK, because they have revealed the hollowness of the global Britain aspirations, but also raised questions with respect to who are Britain's friends. And insofar as security and defence is concerned, either Britain cooperates with the EU if we want to build up greater strategic autonomy, or there's little chance that either is going to be playing much of a role. So in the near future, that is, of course. So I think Brexit really has uncovered things. There's one more point that I try to reiterate it, especially to the Brussels community, that sometimes we underestimate the degree to which EU performance, especially in the Eurozone crisis, affected the British public in voting in favour of leaving the European Union. The Eurozone crisis really revealed the differential treatment of EU member states. And I think in the UK, many were quite sympathetic with the Greeks, to put it very simply. And there hasn't been much reflection on this in the EU. It's assumed that it's the awkward partner that left because they, suddenly were led by captured by Eurosceptic minority, and it's got nothing to do with European Union performance, whereas it has. So okay. I would encourage that kind of reflection on this side of the channel as well.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Helen, over to you briefly.
Yeah, I mean, on internal cohesion, I think a lot of the things that have already been said demonstrates how the EU kind of, it can accommodate all sorts of uncomfortable coexistences. So the EU is able to accommodate a considerable amount of internal sort of disagreement and so on, whether that's, so it's a form of ambiguity, whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure. I mean, earlier research that I was involved in with some others who might be here today sort of did show that in the early years after Brexit, the radical right, certainly in a number of key countries that held elections, including France, were not, as we put it, so eager to leave. And yeah, I mean, that needs to perhaps to be redone. But so yeah, two things: the EU, I think, is ambiguous enough, or kind of. There is another question, and I know the question from Neil is about the Franco-German relationship, and I just wanted to say on that the relationship itself is fairly strong. I mean, it has institutional and it has structural foundations, and it has weathered a whole number of changes of men and women at the top, mainly men. So it's not so much that, but I think Franco-German relationship itself, and perhaps the most recent European Council showed that as well. It's perhaps less sufficient. It's not the only sort of game in town. It's still important, but yeah, there are other member states perhaps who have kind of diluted that relationship in a sense. So that I just wanted to address that question.
Thank you, Helen. And Vincent.
Thank you. I don't think I'll speak much on Brexit. I just want to say, Rosa, thank you for your perspectives. It definitely gave me something to think. On internal cohesion, I think it's really the big dilemma the EU could, like the biggest possible dilemma the EU could find itself in, particularly with regards to Hungary. On one side, the EU is a champion for the rule of law, democracy. On the other side, it prides itself in finding compromise. And here, those two things seem to be irreconcilable, right? Like you either find a compromise, but then you ignore the breach in rule of law, or you don't find a compromise, but then you kind of have to strongly tap down on one of the member states. With that being said, I do believe that there is a structural flaw in the EU treaty in that it is impossible for a member state to be kicked out for gross violation of European values. I don't think a country should be kicked out necessarily, but I think that mechanism should exist in order to even kind of force or encourage compromise and compliance. It's very interesting that if a country aspires to join the European Union that has to agree unanimously to have that member be admitted can pressure very hard for that country to increase its level of rule of law, or its efficiency of rule of law, its democracy, equality, all these kind of things. But once a member is a member state, it essentially can do whatever it wants, and there is no ultimate consequence in Article 7. So in our book, we actually advocate for a change to Article 7 that would include a kick-out clause. I don't think it should be used. I don't think it would be used, but I think it would be a structural necessity just to have that option on the table. Yeah, let me just leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. Food for thought, Vincent. Shada, over to you.
Yeah, I think, Vincent, there's a real danger in doing that, because we're very state-oriented about Europe. We forget, and you don't, obviously, people's Europe. And, a lot of people would be very and really be in dire straits if that was to happen, because even in the countries that we're talking about, there are strong pro-European sentiments. There are mayors and civil society that would really, we need a kind of maybe a warning shot, and maybe a more complicated, but throwing a country out, I think, would damage the reality of the people's lives there. So I'm really wary of that. And that's my problem with sanctions more generally as well, when we talk about sanctioning. On Brexit, two uncomfortable and inconvenient. One is on diversity agenda of the EU. The fact that Brexit happened means that a lot of brown and black British people have left. That includes from the European Parliament. And I think that's a big blow to the diversity agenda. And that was something that we found comfort in the fact that there were people in the corridors of power who were not all white. And secondly, inconvenient truth as well. I mean, Rosa has talked about global Britain being shown to be shallow and hollow. And I think that's true for global Europe as well. In fact, in my conversations with many Asians and Africans, global Europe is actually being, may say so, quite a kick for Europe, because it is a very, very strong competitor in terms of, maybe it's just reputation, maybe it's just symbolic. But the EU, geopolitical EU, has had quite a lot of trouble dealing with the fact that global Britain, brilliant diplomats, European, British diplomats out there in the China, in India, in Indonesia, and Europe is trying to up its game to meet that challenge of global Britain. It's something that a lot of people in London, pro-Europeans and also in Brussels, don't want to hear. But the truth is, if you talk to our colleagues across the world, they do not think global Britain is any different, actually, from the shallowness, or let's say also the complexity of geopolitical Europe. So same difference, if you like, but competition for the EU, for sure.
Thank you. And the final word to you, Brigid.
So on European cohesion or EU cohesion, clearly the cleavages are there. But I think there are the last two internal crises that the EU confronted. In fact, you did see collective capacity. First was Brexit. the EU responded in a unified way, and that unity survived any attempt by the UK to divide and conquer. But it also characterized the pandemic. So the EU had inevitably, because there was a scramble for ICU beds and for equipment at the beginning, it looked as if this would be a very divisive issue. But in fact, on vaccines, there was a shared vaccine procurement process, which avoided vaccine nationalism in Europe, which would have been a disaster. It really would have been extremely damaging. And that was an offer from the larger countries with greater purchasing power to the many, many small member states in the EU, all 22 of them. So that was a cohesive Europe responding. Also then the recovery, the RRF, if anyone had said in January 2020 that by July the EU would have a facility characterized by shared borrowing, no one would have believed it possible. And again, if you look very carefully at the negotiations of the RRF, even those, the four frugals who really didn't want this to happen, in the end couldn't prevent it and opted not to prevent it. So I think despite all the deep cleavages that are there, and managing diversity is a challenge for the EU and always will be, in my view. But when push comes to shove on those two last crises, there was collective capacity. Now, is that something that translates into the future? It's impossible to tell. On Brexit, Brexit is lose-lose for the EU and the UK. No one in the EU across the 27 either welcomed it, wanted it, or, but that said, when confronted by the UK choice, then the EU did defend itself and its core interests, and in my view, very effectively. Relations are extremely poor and have been damaged. And I think as long as Johnson is a Prime Minister of the UK and David Frost is their Brexit man, then I don't see this relationship improving at all. I think that there is deep mistrust, and for good reason, with London. I also think that what Brexit has shown us, which is not something I think I would have concluded before the process, is that the UK is simply not an indispensable EU member state. And that's a surprise to me. That is a surprise to me. Germany is an indispensable EU member state. France is an indispensable EU member state. I would argue Italy is an indispensable, but the UK is not. And that for me was a revelation that Brexit offered, which I wouldn't have concluded prior to the UK's departure.
Okay, I see I have instructions from the control tower that we can go on for a couple of minutes, but I hesitate because the questions are so big. But one question from Simon Sweeney: if Europe is to continue with a focus on its interests in other areas, not just trade, how real is the push for strategic autonomy given the US-Asia pivot? Is Europe, the EU, ready for strategic autonomy? I'll take the second question as well from Neil Mortimer. As Angela Merkel retires as German Chancellor and France perhaps continuing one-term presidencies, that's copyright Helen Drake, can the EU be pessimistic or optimistic on future relations between the big two? Maybe not everybody in the panel needs to answer, but if anybody wants to express a view on either of those two questions, either from Simon or from Neil, now is your opportunity. Otherwise, we close. Vincent, over to you, sir. Quickly, please.
Yeah, very quickly. I would agree with Helen's general assessment that the German-Franco relationship is very strong and will survive all sorts of leaders. However, my personal opinion is if Rassemblement National with Marine Le Pen would win the presidency, that would be definitely an unprecedented kind of situation. I'm not sure if that would be as easily survivable as past presidencies or chancellorships. So at least in Germany, we really don't hope for that to happen. But I definitely want to say that I think that there is a new element with that being at least a somewhat realistic possibility that is me saying as somebody who's not an expert on France. So Helen, correct me if I'm wrong, but yes.
Okay, I think Helen agrees. On strategic autonomy, we've been talking about it in a rather negative sense without using the phrase too much for the past hour and a half. But anybody have any maybe optimistic or positive things to say about the push for strategic autonomy?
So I wouldn't be optimistic, but I think the functional pressures will be extraordinary, are extraordinary on Europe already and will continue to be. I think that security, and here I'm talking about defense, is an area where the sum of Europe is less than the parts. And that's very hard to achieve that, to actually not manage to leverage what you spend and the capacity that you have. And so I think this is a very slow burn. But you already see, for example, in the Sahel, there is a significant presence of European troops. So I would see on the defense side, it will be much more coalitions of the willing, limited, most likely neighborhood. But there's no doubt that the US pivot to Asia, but also what we saw in Afghanistan, that the Americans, Biden decided he was going to fulfill the Trump agreement without consultation with the Europeans, that Europe must be attentive to its own security in the next phase, and it lives in a relatively dangerous neighborhood. It has neighbors to the east that don't wish it well.
Okay. Well, I think we really do have to bring this to a close. Otherwise, we'll miss the award ceremony starting in about 7 minutes' time, and I will never not be forgiven if I go over time too much. I think that's been a terrific discussion. Thank you so much. A terrific panel. I'm delighted to share the space with my fellow UACES patrons, and welcome to the new ones and slightly older generation. Brigid, you and I have been patrons for a while. I hope the audience enjoyed the discussion as much as I enjoyed moderating it. I learned a lot, food for thought, and stay tuned because we'll now move in a few minutes' time to the awards ceremony. Thank you again, my lovely panel.